Hey everybody, how are you? And happy, well, I'm not even sure what day it is. Isn't that funny? It's Tuesday. It's Tuesday. That's how my life has been going. It's been that busy. So I really wanted to talk to you today about negotiating. Remember, we're starting this series on negotiating, and specifically, we're going to start with this idea of doing emotions, handling emotions. And I think it's really super important. I've got to move this a little bit because of the glare we're getting. All right, so I think it's really super important because, you know, people get really emotional during this period of negotiating. And when a client starts getting emotional, a couple of things happen, and it's not good. And it can really tank your negotiation efforts. And so that's where I'm starting. I'm starting this series on negotiating with handling your client's emotions. And I want to give you some really substantive tactics on how to do it. So the first thing I want to start off with is by talking about how emotions work. Y'all know I'm a psychologist by education, and so I like really talking over some of these things. And so I want to talk about how emotions work. And I think it's really important because it is confusing to many real estate agents. Shoot, it's confusing to just about everybody about emotions. And that's because one thing can happen during a transaction and a buyer and a seller goes, okay, whatever. And the same thing happened to another buyer or seller, and they have a meltdown. And so that's one of the first things that's really confusing about it is one thing can happen and one person's neutral and the next thing happens and the other person has a problem. So let's just talk about how this works. So first thing, education on emotions. When something happens to someone, it goes into their big computer, their brain, and it starts shuffling through experiences. And it goes and equates experiences to them. And their brain makes a decision. Is what just happened good, bad, or neutral? And if it's good or if it's bad, an emotion becomes expelled from that decision. Now, when an emotion happens, two things happen. The first thing happens is there are physiological changes, right? Their blood pressure goes up, their heart rate goes up, their breathing goes up. But then there's also behavioral changes. So when someone becomes emotional, they stop listening. That's one of the first things that happen. They stop making good decisions, right? They become that anger or that joy or whatever it is. Once that emotion kicks in, they start struggling. And that in itself is an issue for you, the real estate agent. One of the things that you have to be most concerned with is how do you keep their emotions neutral through a transaction. Now, as we go into this series, that's really one of the things that we're going to be doing. I'm going to be giving you some really substantive how-tos on how to keep them neutral. But keeping them neutral is really important, otherwise they don't make good decisions. Now, here's the big thing, and this is the thing that I think is really important for you to know. When someone is having a negative experience or a negative emotion, that everybody on earth asks the same question. Are you ready? Who's to blame? Who's to blame is the question they ask when something is going wrong. That is human. Guess what? Guess who the majority of the time gets blamed? Anybody want to answer that? I can go ahead and tell you who that is, and that would be you, the real estate agent. The real estate agent gets blamed. They're the closest one into it. Surely it is their fault, etc., etc. So that is how that loop works. Goes into the brain. If the brain decides it's bad, emotion comes out, physiological changes, behavior changes, and then let's go blame somebody. Let's go blame somebody. So that is how all of that works. And so one of the things that means to you is you're going to have to manage some of the process and, again, keep them very emotional neutral. Now, the point of this Facebook Live session is to give you some really good tactics on how to do that. Now, let me say to you, as I start giving you some of the tactics, I have them right here. As I start giving you some of the tactics, this is a giveaway. So I'm going to ask Shannon if she will post this on the bottom so you can go in and get this. Okay? So, tactic number 1, and this one is really important, and that is to continue putting focus on their goal. So when something happens, let me think of an example. An example is they're upset over an inspection item. The inspector said this was really wrong, or they got upset and started getting scared about something in the inspection. You know, the question is, okay, so what is your goal? What is it that you want to have happen? Let's focus on that. Now, in order to do that, you have to know what their goal is. You have to know what it is that they're trying to accomplish. And you should know that way before we get to this point, that is something you need to ask early on. And by the way, these goals change. So it's very possible that some of the things that you need to say during a negotiation is, all right, so to make sure I understand, these are the goals as we're going forward on this negotiation, because I can get them what they want. They just have to tell me what it is they want. So focus on the goals. Number 2 is to be empathetic. So, to validate what they are thinking by saying things like, I totally understand why you would think that, and many other people have felt the same way. That is a validation of their emotions. If they don't get the validation back from you that it's okay, it's just going to escalate. It's not going to go away. Ignoring it does not make it go away. It simply escalates the problem. So you have to remember that. All right, number 3, don't spend too much time on one point. Acknowledge your understanding, right? How do you acknowledge your understanding? Very often you can repeat it to them. You can say, okay, if I'm hearing you effectively, this is what I've heard. Great. So let's see. Would you like to go ahead and continue negotiating this? Yes or no? So small commitments. Do we want to make one more offer? Small commitments. Asking for those types of things, which is number 4, the small commitments. Do you still want this house? Would you like to continue on this negotiation? Right? Making little small commitments. Number 5, avoid applying pressure at all to anyone, because if you push on them, they will naturally, instinctually, as a human being, they're going to push back. One of my very favorite statements, and somebody introduced this to me years ago, and it has been a glorious skill to have. By the way, as I tell you this, it works really good on husbands too. And that is that very often, and it's just human, people say one thing, but they do another. And they do that primarily because of emotion, right? And I've said this to y'all before, I'm sure. I wake up every day and say, I'm not going to eat sugar, but I assure you I will eat sugar today. And so we do that all the time. And so when you hear something like that going on, when you hear this kind of conflict, instead of pushing against them, you may just reply with, you know what, I'm confused. Because when you say something like that, you have the problem. They don't have the problem. You have the problem. And instinctually, they are going to say to you, confused about what? Well, I'm confused because you said your goal was this, and now we're talking about doing this. So help me explain. Help me understand that. And so very often, that's a good way to push without being pushy, is by saying something like that. I'm confused. That's all it takes. All right, the next one is ask the question, so what? So what? If this falls apart, what happens? If this falls apart, can you live with it? If this falls apart, do we have something else we want to go to? Does it matter? So what? And that's a little bit of the takeaway, right? And the takeaway is a fabulous a fabulous thing. Years ago, I mean, I was young in the business, and I was having this buyer who was sitting on the fence about something. And you know, when somebody sits on the fence, you get splinters. The agent gets splinters in your honey. And it's just a terrible thing when they're sitting there. And I was whining to my broker in charge. There's no other way of putting it. I was whining to her about this. And she said, take it away. And I said, what do you mean? Take it away. Just go to them and say, look, this may not be the right place for you. Why don't we just forget about it and go on? So what if we lose it? Let's just go on and see what their reaction is, because many times that will force them to dig in. That will force them to go, whoa, wait a second. Whoa, just wait just a second. And that is something that I think is really important, to gauge what their reaction is, to understand if that's something they like, or if they go, yeah, I'm willing to do that. Then you didn't need to be sitting on the fence. You needed to go on anyway. So those are 6 tactics that I think are really good. So just to go back, make sure to place focus on their goals. Number 2, be empathetic. Number 3, don't spend much time there. Acknowledge it, move on. Number 4, ask for a small commitment. Number 5, don't apply pressure. Remember, I'm confused. Number 6 is to ask the question, so what? So what? And by the way, this isn't on the giveaway that I'm going to give you, but let me say there's one more thing. I just thought about it that I think is excellent. And if you listen to me at all, you have heard me say this, and that is the personal pronoun thing. And that is when you are dealing and trying not to incite emotions, one of the things that you have to do is make sure that you don't use you and your. Take you and your out of your sentences, because you and your is equivalent of poking them. Just going, and they start getting emotional when you use that. So a lot of times you have to go into third person around that. So you're just going to have to go into third person and say, you know, very often buyers versus, you know, you are, if that makes any sense. And I have for example, let me give you an idea. Let's say that you have a house listed and I have a buyer who is interested in it, and I think the price is off. If I pick up the phone and call you and say, Mary, so I have somebody that's interested in your house, but you know, can you explain to me you and your seller's pricing? Then you would probably say, bite me, right? Because I said you and your sellers, and it feels like you're poking. If I pick up the phone and call you and say, Mary, can you give me the thought process behind the price? Then it's a lot more collaborative versus accusatory. So that is just one of those things. It's just a little basic skills. And we're going to be talking about skills that are surrounding negotiation a lot in the next few weeks. So we are going to be talking about that. But as I was standing here talking about it, I thought I want to mention that as well. I'll probably mention it later, but it's worth the to mention. All right, so download the giveaway. Make sure to do that. And please watch out for announcements on when we're coming back, because we're going to be doing a lot more information about negotiating, because the negotiating market, just the market, has so many extremes. We need to get our skills keyed up here on negotiating. All right, I'll see you next time.